The Tories are still doing their best to drag the country further into a waking nightmare. They have now successfully passed another piece of rights-restricting legislation in the form of the Public Order Bill. And if you need a reminder, this is a set of laws intended to mop up all of the nastiest amendments cut from the 2022 Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act. It cracks down on protest and public disruption. As you can imagine, that is a very vague and subjective term with plenty of room for interpretation and abuse of power, just how the current crop of Tories like it. The House of Lords managed to remove some of the most draconian amendments to the bill, including police powers to preemptively restrict protests if they predict, by Mystic Meg powers, that they will become disrupted later down the line. But here is some of what remains in the final form of the Public Order Bill, which may as well just be called the Anti-Just Stop Oil Bill. Some key points. It creates a new offence of interfering with key national infrastructure like airports or railways, carrying a maximum 12-month jail sentence or an unlimited fine, or both. It carries an offence for locking on, which is attaching yourself to buildings or objects, which now comes with a maximum 6-month jail sentence, an unlimited fine, or both. Police are equipped with new suspicionless stop and search powers and serious disruption prevention orders, which restrict being in a certain place for those labelled as likely to cause serious disruption. If that sounds bad to you, you are not alone. Even Tory MPs spoke out against the new powers for police. Here's David Davis in the Commons on Monday.
I find myself, I'm afraid, in agreement with the opposition spokesman. I also support the Casey recommendations, based as they were on a horrifying report about the behaviour of the Met over the years. And let's be clear, no government of any persuasion has actually managed to get the Met to behave, and not just the Met, other police forces too, in a manner which is acceptable to the public. Bear in mind, there have been governments of both orientations since Stephen Lawrence. The second point I would make very quickly is that when the Home Secretary in 2010, Theresa May, for those who don't remember, limited stop and search, she did not do so out of an excess of liberal sympathy. She did so because at that point in time, stop and search was being used in such a way that it caused serious problems, race relations problems, in several parts of the country. Now, that stop and search was largely targeted on stopping violence, because at that point, and it may well still be true today, but at that point, the perpetrators of knife crime and the victims of knife crime mostly came from minority communities. That's why the minority communities themselves were not happy about the operation of the system, but they understood why it was there. That is an order of magnitude different from using suspicionless stop and search for controlling demonstrations.
Davis's objections are being backed by a pretty significant ally, the UN. Here is a press release the organisation dropped today. UN Human Rights Chief urges UK to reverse deeply troubling Public Order Bill. Volker Turk, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, does not mince his words. Turk said, "This new law imposes serious and undue restrictions on these rights that are neither necessary nor proportionate to achieve a legitimate purpose as defined under international law. This law is wholly unnecessary as UK police already have the powers to act against violent and disruptive demonstration. It's especially worrying that the law expands the powers of the police to stop and search individuals, including without suspicion, defines some of the new criminal offences in a vague and overly broad manner, and imposes unnecessary and disproportionate criminal sanctions on people organising or taking part in peaceful protests." Now, Turk saved particular attention for serious disruption prevention orders, adding, "The grave risk here is that these orders preemptively limit someone's future legitimate exercise of their rights. I'm also concerned that the law appears to target in particular peaceful actions used by those protesting about human rights and environmental issues. As the world faces the triple planetary crisis of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution, governments should be protecting and facilitating peaceful protests on such existential topics, not hindering and blocking them." Now, he finished that by asking the UK government to, quote, reverse the legislation as soon as feasible. Given that Home Secretary Suella Braverman was on Nick Ferrari's LBC show on Wednesday slamming environmental protesters as eco-zealots and championing the public order bill, that seems unlikely. Now, here is what she said.
What is your instruction to police officers if they see the highways being blocked in this fashion?
I think it all depends on individual circumstances. And the issue with these militant protesters is one that I know many of your listeners and indeed myself are incredibly frustrated. These eco-zealots are selfish, they are disruptive, they're causing misery to many people who can't get to work, who can't get to hospital, who can't get to school. If they're causing a level of disruption which is serious, which meets the criminal threshold, then the police must definitely intervene and arrest. We have seen, incidentally, over recent years, thousands of, approximately 1,000 arrests being made, hundreds of convictions. In fact, last week we saw, or very recently, one such arrest leading to a custodial sentence for one of the protesters who was hanging from the gantries on
Indeed,
the Dartford Tunnel.
If I take to the streets of London, I think the new tactics is that I and my colleagues, were I to join this group, we're going to walk at a snail's pace. Should we be arrested for that?
I think these are decisions for the operationally independent police.
Well,
and
is there a law that
judge
provides
the
for their
facts.
arrest, Home Secretary? Is there a law
if it constitutes an obstruction of the highway, that will be the offence with which those people will be charged. But there is, as I say, a threshold that needs to be met. This is why we're passing the public order bill, soon to be an act. We want to improve and increase the police powers available so that they can take more swift action. That's why, incidentally, we tried to amend the level of serious disruption recently. That was blocked by Labour. They preferred to side with the militant protesters. So it's going to take us a bit of time before we can increase and enhance police powers in taking action against the very scenario to which you're referring, Nick.
Now, even without the public order bill, environmental protesters are still being hit with the full whack of the law at the moment. In October last year, 2 Just Stop Oil protesters shut down the Dartford crossing. It was out of operation for just under 48 hours. And last week, they were sentenced to more than 2.5 years in prison. Now, 34-year-old Marcus Decker received 2 years and 7 months in prison, while 40-year-old Morgan Trowland was given 3 years. The judge in their case said they had to be, quote, punished for causing chaos and in order to deter copycats. It's worth mentioning that the pair have been held on remand, meaning they've been in jail awaiting trial since October 2022, which adds about 6 extra months onto their sentences respectively. Sean, why are the government increasingly using climate protesters as their justification for this sort of rights-robbing legislation?
It might be that the climate movement is one of the biggest threats to state power because it is a sort of broad-based movement that includes people across generations, of course, but especially young people, but across like lines of class, ethnicity, race, and it's only going to continue growing because the climate crisis is growing, and I think younger generations and right down Gen Z, even younger, are going to increasingly become angry with governments and I don't know, the older world's failings in respect of the climate crisis. So I think if you enter the mindset for a minute, which I don't really care to, but of the Tories and of Suella Braverman, I think what here is this idea is an attempt to dissuade people, to make it really punitive from joining these movements, to make it something that isn't easy to do, that people have to think twice about, that you have to have that extra layer of heroism in order to be a climate activist engaged in civil disobedience. I think that's a large part of it. And of course, that's in the interests of the Tories and their donors, many of whom are sort of deeply enwrapped with the fossil fuel industry.